Ever since I was a teenager, I've been obsessed with a certain subgenre of metal called folk metal. I got my start in the genre like many people with the Finnish band Turisas. In the UK, a lot of people seem to have got into the band for a sample CD that came with the magazine Metal Hammer, a storied UK publication that's kinda like Kerrang but for old people. And if you're too young to remember magazines, they were things us boomers bought to get info before the widespread use of the internet.
Man, 1910 times were scary!
I honestly do forget how old I am sometimes. And the track that I heard on this particular CD blew my teenager mind. Battle metal is a rip-roaring folk metal banger that completely sums up the entire subgenre perfectly. Men dressed up like idiots singing about swords and battles with guitars and accordions. What more could you want out of life?
That's why I give my kids
folk metal.
a fool.
Holy shit, you fucking killed her, dude!
I've always said that folk metal is kinda like what ska is to punk. The goofy and fun red-headed stepchild subgenre. I mean, folk metal shows are honestly as fun as a ska show. You're not gonna end up going home in an ambulance like a death metal or hardcore show, that's for sure. But ever since I heard this track, I've been enamored with this genre of music. And I've been to a ton of folk metal shows and had a blast. I still remember vividly getting battle metal at a HMV, and then getting it home and playing the hell out of it. Sure, I'd heard folk-infused genres before because I was and still am to this day a big fan of folk punk, but I'd never heard anything that mixed in this kind of heaviness. I'm pretty sure my love of folk-infused music comes from my mum, who always played a lot of folk music in the house when I was a kid. And in 2007, 8 days after my 16th birthday, they blew my mind further with their magnum opus, The Varangian Way, which is still one of my favourite albums to this day. I just so happened to finally get an Xbox 360 around the time this album came out, so needless to say I spent a lot of time wandering the woods of oblivion with this album blaring. But it wasn't until 2008 when I got full tilt into finding loads of folk metal bands. I'll never forget leafing through the CDs in my old local record store, and finding an album called Carcello by some band called Corpiclani that I'd never heard of. But the album cover looked cool, so I asked my friend who ran the shop to put it on for me, and this is what I heard. I remember laughing and thinking it was wild. Needless to say, I bought the CD. The days when you would buy stuff just because it had a cool album cover. And the days where we actually had to pay for albums and appreciate them.
Old grey mare, she ain't what she used to be.
Finding Corpiclani made me realise there was actually a whole genre of this crazy music that I love. So after this I found every folk metal band I could. I got Fintroll's Natfod, Insufferum's Victory Songs, and Ailstorm's Captain Morgan's Revenge. And then my lifelong love of this music was cemented. So all of this is a long-winded way of me saying I love folk metal. So let's talk about its history. Folk metal might not have been a thing until the 90s, but straight up rock had been flirting with infusing folk since the 60s. One of the bands leading this folk rock blend was the Los Angeles group The Byrds. Spelt wrong, because they're so cool. And their cover of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man gave this acoustic folky number a rocky redo.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man.
And Bob Dylan himself was flirting with adding rock elements to his usual folk on the album, bringing it all back home. And not to be forgotten, London's T-Rex brought this fusion of rock and folk to new heights.
I could have loved you good like a planet.
But a lot of this stuff is honestly out of my wheelhouse. But a 60s and 70s folk rock band that is in my wheelhouse is Jethro Tull, who truly brought the folk to the fore, with frontman Ian Anderson's flute playing being very prominent. Their first two albums were more of a bluesy affair that just so happened to have flute, but it really came together with 1971's Aqua Lung, where the folk and rock elements were brought together beautifully. And 1972's Thick as a Brick further perfected this in a sprawling 2-track 43-minute epic.
You'd be thick as a brick.
In the tidal destruction, the moral moray.
Metal fans might not want to hear this after Tull took the Best Metal Performance Award from Metallica at the 1989 Grammys, but they're a big influence on folk metal.
And the winner is Crest of a Knave, Jethro Tull.
But I think some things that also had an influence on the genre was the 60s and 70s experimentation of bands like Rainbow with songs like Temple of the King. All the elements that would be staples of folk metal are present here. The sword and sorcery lyrics of band frontman Ronnie James Dio, and the folky stabs of band creative madman Ritchie Blackmore. And Uriah Heep also had the same feel on songs like The Wizard.
He was the wizard of 1,000 kings.
Of course, some actual out-and-out metal obviously influenced the genre, but that was mainly on a band-to-band basis more than some missing link band. because a lot of the early bands just added folk into their preferred style of metal. However, I feel like the genre definitely owes a lot to heavy metal, power metal, and black metal. Oh, and of course thrash metal, because the de facto patient zero of folk metal was essentially a thrash band with folk bits. We would probably not have folk metal if it wasn't for one English thrash band called Sabbath breaking up. Sabbath formed in Nottingham in 1985 under the name Hydra with future Skyclad frontman Martin Walker and bassist Fraser Crask. Later they were joined by guitarist Andy Sneap before changing their name to Sabbath. Andy Sneap said on the band, "The most impressive thing about the band was the fact that Fraser had already printed 2 colour t-shirts and he had a car. Sabbath is essentially another word for Sabbath, which is a gathering of witches." And this hinted at the fact that Walker was big into his paganism, which would later become a staple of most folk metal bands' lyrics. In 1986, the band unleashed its first release, a 3-track demo called Fragments of a Forgotten Faith. And this got the band a lot of buzz and they were featured in Kerrang!, which later led to them recording a flexi-disc single for the Warhammer magazine White Dwarf called and this led to the band getting signed by a German label called Noise. And this label at the time had bands like Creator, Celtic Frost and Halloween, so it was an ideal fit for the band. And under this label they released their first full-length album, History of a Time to Come. Although the album is a straight-up ripper with echoes of Venom, Merciful Fate and Slayer, there are some slightly mellow folky moments that hint at Martin's future endeavours. And this did very well for the band and garnered them a lot of fans and media attention. In 1989 they followed this album up with Dreamweaver. This album further doubles down on Martin's pagan and Anglo-Saxon spiritual beliefs, things that would later define the whole subgenre. But thanks to the poor management of Noise, the band split up over money troubles, and Martin went off and started a band that is the grandfather to every folk metal band, Skyclad, which funny enough is a pagan term for ritual nudity. And in 1991 they released their debut album, The Wayward Sons of Mother Earth. And while most of the album was your usual heavy metal and thrash, there was little bits of folky instrumentation in places. And this is no more prominent than on Widdershins' Jig. This is probably the first song that can truly and purely be termed as a folk metal song. All the elements were there. And on the follow-up, A Burnt Offering for the Bone Idol a year later, the band ramped up the folk to 11.
Right across the board. 11, 11,
and most of
11, and then
amps go up to 10.
On this album, the folk was a lot more prominent and defined, and I would honestly say this is the first true full folk metal album, and I bloody love it. Instead of being heavy metal with folk elements, it was a true new subgenre. And honestly, Skyclad don't get enough respect. They're amazing and Martin is a top lad. Usually when you're talking about early folk metal bands, Crucia Khan, or however you're supposed to say it, will be one of the first ones to come up. The band formed in Dublin in 1992 and they tried to infuse more Celtic influences into their brand of folk metal. Unlike Skyclad, who put folky elements onto a heavy metal frame, Crucia Khan put Celtic sounds and standards over the skeleton of black metal. And in 1995 they displayed this potent mix with their album Taraf Nagal, or however you're supposed to say it. Well, that song was proper folk metal-y, wasn't it? The band was very influenced by Skyclad, as you could probably hear. Sadly, the band got offered a bad deal from Century Media and disbanded in 1997, but they reformed in 1999 and thankfully went on to be very successful. I'm personally a massive fan of their 2004 album Pagan. If you haven't heard it, check out the title track for this album. It's an atmospheric folk black metal banger. The next band in this vein I want to talk about is Spain's Mago de Oz, which literally just translates to The Wizard of Oz.
Alrighty then.
Who is another one of these early bands, although their debut in 1994 wasn't really folk metal. From what I can gather, it was a weird bunch of blues songs done in a weird folky style like they were Dexy's Midnight Runners or something. But the 1996 follow-up is where their first folk metal contribution lies. It was a concept album based on the idea of a modern day Jesus in Madrid. And while it did still have some of their more bluesy trappings, on tracks like The Fallen Angel, the folk metal shows its teeth. And I think I'll round out these early folk metal bands with Germany's Subway to Sally, who started out as a more folk rocky group on their 1994 debut. And they would keep this sound on their second album, but started to add a bit more bite to the rock side of their sound. But it was on their third album, Tease the Demon, that they truly went folk metal in 1996. A think that covers most of the early innovators, but I'm sure there's some I'm missing. Be sure to tell me who I'm missing in the comments, if more than one person watches this video. Although there was all these early folk metal innovators, they were disparate and unconnected. There wasn't really a scene or a codified genre at that point. Until one troll-obsessed band from Finland bubbled to the surface. Fintroll, one of my favourite bands of all time. The band formed in 1997 and released their debut album Midnight Beasts in 1999. Midnight Beasts was a 30-minute slab of folk-infused black metal with constant smatterings of Finnish humpa polka rhythms. I can't even contain how much I love this album. If any album has me going, that's weird, I'm probably gonna love it. They followed up this opus with another opus, Time of the Hunt, in 2001. And this album did so well for the band that they actually charted in their native Finland. But a member of another band important to the folk metal boom, John Javella, featured on this album. And this man is of course the singer of Korpiklani, best known for their Alcoholics Anonymous anthems.
Hell yeah!
The roots of Korpiklani goes all the way back to 1993, where they formed under the name Shamani Duo to be an in-house restaurant band. Kinda reminds me of that bit from Blues Brothers, except with folk.
Murph and the Magic Tones? Look at you in those candy-ass monkey suits.
Later, John relocated and formed the band Shaman, which released its debut Idja in 1999. This album, while definitely metal to some degree, had less folk and was more tribal chanting over metal. But in 2002, after John worked with Fintroll, Shaman released Shamanic, where you can definitely hear the Fintroll influence and the folk metal coming in fully. After this change in direction, the band changed its name to Korpiklani in 2003, which means backwoods clans in English. Sounds a bit Deliverance to me, but okay. Korpiklani signed with Austrian record label Napalm and released 2003's Spirit of the Forest. And this was the defined version of Korpiklani we would all come to love. And this video is legendary. Every time I see the violinist kick open that door, I laugh. And with these two bands, the scene as we know it had its foundation and started to take shape. Another important early band in this Finnish folk metal explosion was the band Innovators. They formed in 1995 before putting out a string of demos from 1997 to 1999. A lot of these tracks would be reworked and put onto their debut album 2001's self-titled Innovators. Although they probably had the hardest edge of any of these bands, they fit into this group of bands and helped round out the scene. But I'm sure I would be shouted at if I didn't mention the last big player in the early Finnish scene, Moon Sorrow. They formed in 1995 and started off playing more hardline black metal with folky embellishments on their first two demos in 1997 and 1999 respectively. But like many of the trailblazers I've mentioned today, in the early 2000s they released their first proper debut. Like a lot of the other bands, the folk was brought up a bit more on this debut album. There was now a folk metal scene thanks to these bands. Of course, there was also Turissus, who came a little bit later with 2004's battle metal that got me into the genre in the first place. Turissus really cemented the pageantry of folk metal with their furs and war paint. And they really put folk metal on the map with their barnstorming cover of Boney M's Rasputin. In the wake of this explosion, a bunch of great bands would carry the torch of folk metal, probably most prominent among these being Scotland's Alestorm. I got into Alestorm not too long after their debut album was released, and they're one of my favourite bands to this day. And they are probably one of the biggest folk metal bands going. They bring that sense of fun that folk metal has been all about since its inception. And it was really nice a few years ago seeing Windrose rise to meme prominence with their cover of Diggy Diggy Hole. Of course, I could sit here all day naming newer folk metal bands that I love, but this video is about the history of folk metal, so maybe I'll save that for another video, if I do one. Folk metal might not be the biggest subgenre going, but it's got a lot of heart and the community is always friendly and inviting. If you don't have fun at a folk metal show, there honestly might be something wrong with you. But anyway, that's the end of my first video. Let me know what you thought of it down in the comments below and tell me about your history with the genre. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more videos, at some point, maybe. I've been The Lad, and I thank you for watching.